So let's begin with browsers. Tim started the day with a keynote about how browsers are problematic right now and how he thinks that they can be salvaged, but they have to be changed in fundamental ways, I would say. I think that the one missing thing from that keynote was the issue about security and how browsers are this huge attack surface. So do you think that that can change? Do you think that that can be fixed? And how do you, how Martin and Erik, how do you feel about browsers?
Well, the attack surface is huge, and you know, the great appeal of the browser as a platform is its generality. It's sort of a general purpose user interface for anything, with a general purpose scripting language for anything, with a general purpose multimedia gateway for anything, all packaged into a desktop package, and people love that. And is it possible to build something that has a sufficient level of generality to be a browser as you would recognize it, and still have a tightly controlled attack surface that would be substantially qualitatively better than what we have today? It's not obvious to me that it's not possible, but it's also not obvious at all that it is possible. I mean, at the end of the day, you need a general purpose programming language in there, and probably not a hard-ass statically typed, you know, maximally locked down kind of programming language either. So it's going to be really tough to do that. Now, having said that, you know, I observe that many mobile apps that I'm aware of are embedding web views and, you know, downloading executable functions in one form or another. So it's not obvious to me that, you know, native mobile apps are in principle qualitatively more secure than browsers.
And I'm wondering whether there's actually so much value in talking about the size of the attack surface. I think if it's sufficiently large, anybody who is motivated will actually find something to their liking and will be able to attack the system. So even if you said from tomorrow on, no more web browsers, everybody has to write native apps on mobile devices and desktop computers, I think I agree with you. They have smaller attack surfaces in the APIs and the SDKs that are at your disposal. But at the same time, I think they are still big enough that anybody who's suitably motivated will find a way in. Mm-hmm. So it's a shame, but it's not a big difference, I think.
You know, I get nervous about that line of thinking, because it seems to me that when you reduce the size of the attack surface, in principle you always win, because, you know, it makes certain classes of attack uneconomic that previously would have been economic. And, you know, you can never find a switch that will turn all the potential things off. But, you know, I think of security a lot like system optimization. All you can ever do is move the bottleneck around. You know, there's always something that's running slow, so you profile, you find out what that is, you fix it, and then something else is bottlenecking your system. And I think of security in really a similar way. You know, there's the weak spot in your system, and you fix that, and well, then that will uncover the next weak spot in your system.
I think one of the interesting things with browsers is that, in a way, they're one of the worst things about them is that there's not very many big, complicated targets for people to go after, right? Because there's only 3 or 4 browsers that are worth attacking, and they all have a big user base. But also, because of that fact, they also have really sorted out rapid updates. Even Internet Explorer now will update relatively rapidly compared to, you know, when we used to wait ages for system patches. And that also alters the economics of attack quite significantly, because things can be patched really quickly now.
That's really true if the company is interested in patching it. What it seems to be the problem, at least with Microsoft nowadays, is to convince them that something actually is a security problem. And this has happened with Chrome as well, where it takes 6 months for a researcher to convince Google or Microsoft that, yeah, actually this can be used to really, really attack.
On the other hand, to their credit, they still run the phone-to-own competition.
Yeah.
And I noticed that last year, for the first time, Pinkie Pie didn't crack it in 15 minutes. I think they were bursting champagne bottles in the hallways at Google.
Right, but they still cracked Chrome.
Eventually, did they?
Yes,
yeah, right.
They did.
But isn't that almost an argument for the browser then? That you can more easily update the whole environment, the whole execution environment, namely the browser, whereas if you talk about native applications, it's the SDKs, and then of course the vendors would have to roll out whatever patches they need to do, an operating system update. It's probably harder to do. Is that almost a case for the browser?
Yeah, and also it's the point that Tim made in his keynote that, you know, if you've got a security problem in your app, and your app is a mobile app, then it's going to take a while, particularly if it's on Apple, to actually get the security update put through. While if it's a web app, you can get it really fast.
Or in Europe, but that's not. Okay, no.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to identity, because this is still, and I have a pet peeve about passwords, but on the other hand, I don't think that there's anything better out there. But one of the proposals, and I know Tim is really happy about the wave of identity providers that are coming right now, and allowing companies like Google to run the identity management, and then you can, in your application, use, say, Google as a provider of identities, and you don't have to manage two-factor authentication and passwords and all of these things. Are we moving towards a space where there's going to be a few big companies that is actually in charge of the identity management of all of us, and are there any risks in that?
There are huge risks in that, and so I was working heavily in the OAuth and OpenID Connect space and so on, and I'm pretty convinced that those protocols are more or less technically sound. There's nothing deeply wrong with them. But here's the problem, is password outsourcing, sort of federated login. Unfortunately, in practice, that means you put the red box for Google and you put the blue box for Facebook, and hey, now I have federated signing. And I'm not sure what the right number of identity providers for the internet is, but I'm pretty sure it's not 2. And unfortunately, that's what we have now. And it's a hard problem, because if you are building an app of some sort on your landing page, how many other people do you want to give branding for? Right? And we call it in the identity circles the NASCAR problem, because if you have too many identity providers, you start to look like one of those American race cars with the stickers all over it. So we need to crack that problem. Now, there's some promising work being done in a thing called Account Chooser, which is a thing that runs in your browser's local storage and just remembers, without ever sending anything over the wire, what accounts you've used to sign into things. And then when you hit an app, it could pop up a list saying, here are the different Google and Yahoo and Microsoft and so on accounts that you've used. And it turns out there's some hard problems bootstrapping that. But if you could, I think that's actually a really nice idiom. The actual device that you're using to sign in remembers what accounts you've used. And not too much details about them, not too much reporting, there's not too much data tracking going on. And it turns out that you already see that when you try and sign into something with Google. You see the list of the Google accounts, right? And it turns out Apple TV does that as well. You can't actually directly ask for a password in an Apple TV app. You have to say, well, show the account chooser and see if one already exists. So if we could bootstrap, that would be very interesting, because it would actually allow a ecosystem of IDPs to develop. I mean, in principle, I don't see why your university or your insurance company or your motor vehicle licensing or, I don't know, your professional association shouldn't be an interesting IDP.
Well, okay, so let me go on that line, because one of the things that I'm seeing happening right now is the idea of governments and countries being IDPs. This is happening, I know it happening in the UK, I think it's on the way in India as well, especially countries where you already have electronic or ID cards with chip in them. This idea of the government as an IDP is coming along. Is this something that is going to be good or bad for us?
That's a horribly complicated issue. Now, by the way, in England, that's over. They actually backed away from that, and they actually passed legislation forbidding the government to get into the identity provision business, and they're still dealing with the consequences of that, largely because the Tories ran on the basis of squashing this evil Labour program. On the other hand, if you look at the project that's going on in India, it's kind of heartwarming. There are many people who simply fell outside the basket of the provision of social services, and were subject to the most awful corruption and abuse, because they had no notion of identity, of how you could get stuff to people. And so on the one hand, you worry about governments getting out of control and abusing identity information, and the national security agencies misusing that. On the other hand, if you look at what's actually happening in India, it's hard to avoid being sympathetic to that effort. So I'm not just not going to give you a simple answer. I think that there are probably situations where it makes all sorts of sense to have government-based IDPs. It really depends what kind of a government it is.
And what kind of controls they put through
Exactly.
that.
Yeah, and what the government can become, which is the really big issue.
But I think it's an important thing to have, just to create some pull to create more identity providers. I mean, I understand what Tim says about all the technicalities about software you could write and browser caches, local storage to remember the providers you had. But I think there is something in the way the the web and the internet companies in general work, that normally you go towards centralization. They're very hard to differentiate their services, and normally there's fewer and fewer companies that are making it, because the users end up congregating to the smaller ones that work, to a small number of the ones that work better, and then the other ones fall by the wayside. You can already see that, like my OpenID, and also they all stop working in favor of the bigger ones. And I think no matter what we do as technologists to implement better solutions that would allow a variety of companies provide identity services, I think it just will not happen for other reasons. For network effects, not technical network effects, social network effects, and also this small differentiation, and every service that works a tiny bit better will get more users, and then more users will stream to that. So I think it's quite good that other trends are there that will force a larger number of identity providers again.
And of course, it's like so many of the things, the real issue here isn't things like the crypto and the security and the kinds of stuff that geeks like to worry about. The real problem is in the user experience. And how do you make the user experience such that people can easily log into things and easily do things that are relatively secure? I mean, I'm at the point I can at least persuade some of my non-technical friends to look at password managers. But still, I mean, I know frighteningly large amounts of people still secure very important documents with a 4-letter password.
Or if they have a good password, but they use the good password both for their bank and their dog grooming WordPress site.
Yes.
You know,
Exactly.
But you know, I think password managers are an interesting direction. You know, I don't want to disrespect them. The problem with password managers is they have mixed very poorly with mobile. Password manager in your desktop experience is actually pretty good. You know, I have one password. It's really complicated, but I don't mind typing it into. I happen to use one password, but you know, on a regular basis. LastPass, which is one of them, has a pretty nice integration with the YubiKey thingy. So instead of typing the password, you can just stick this to your phone and unlock LastPass, and then you can get the password and paste it in. I don't know if that's good enough for the non-technical people, but it's at least a step in the right direction.
I mean, if you want to be secure, there's a lot of stuff you can do like that. I personally am not a huge fan of LastPass because it comes back to doing crypto in JavaScript and browser technology, which I'm very uncomfortable about. But password managers, for me, is the #1 step forward in the right direction of managing passwords. I agree that from a mobile phone perspective, it's tricky, but on the other hand, I don't know if if I would recommend people to have their whole password list on a mobile phone when most people don't even have a passcode on their mobile phone. I don't feel like mobiles is a safe area for these kind of things nowadays. But
then turning the question back to you, if you have the choice between using an identity provider or one of a number of identity providers or a password manager?
I would probably prefer a password manager for most things, because I feel like an identity provider is putting all of my eggs in one basket. I have to trust one identity provider or a few of them. While with a password manager, I can distribute my trust. I can have several different password manager files. In fact, I have a few I have a password manager file on USB sticks around my neck that doesn't have the same passwords as I have on my main computer, because I can kind of distribute my trust and physically manage my trust.
You know, but like you said, it's the UX that comes back to it. You know, what will work for us and what will work for the general population is different.
Oh, absolutely.
And you know, right now I cannot my friends, I don't know about your friends, people I know, are increasingly doing everything with their mobiles. And I cannot practically sell them a password manager as long as they, and now you just type in your master password on the mobile, because that sucks. It's a horrible experience. I don't even like doing it.
No, I like the idea of delegating trust on a mobile phone, but that trust should be different from the trust that you have when you're running on a laptop, I suspect.
That's going to be a tough sell in the general population.
Yeah,
it really
maybe.
is.
And do you think that's technically actually very possible? How would the service provider know for sure that you're coming from a mobile phone to accept one form of identification, and if you're coming from a web browser on a PC, that you have a different way of authentication?
I think we should have collaboration from the mobile phones, mobile phone applications, because most of the usage of identity providers, as you mentioned in your talk earlier, right now people want apps, and it's probably going to continue like that. And the situation, I mean, there are so many things wrong with apps right now, but if you look at, there was a study done maybe 6 months ago about the security of banking applications on mobile phones, and they found like 60% of the banking applications didn't even verify the certificate, so they were completely open to anyone sitting on the same Wi-Fi doing a man-in-the-middle attack. and that's your banking applications. These
Right.
are the people that really should know what they're doing. So I think the password management is not the first problem to solve, but I do think that with collaboration from app creators, I mean, user agents are used for this all over the place. So an identity manager that just does different things, or gives out different security restrictions.
I think I'm perhaps prejudiced because I spent 2 years at Google in the identity group, sitting right next to the abuse group, like literally,
Yes.
and I heard the war stories from them of the attacks that they're facing, and the 1,000 new attack vectors that crop up every quarter.
Yeah.
And as one of the guys said, I don't think you should type your password into a server managed by any organization that has less than 100 people in the security group. Which is, maybe a slightly extreme view, but, there's some justice to it.
Yeah, absolutely. But on
And-
the other hand, that doesn't necessarily save you either, because you have people with exactly those kind of abuse groups that the last year have had very serious breaches. I mean, if you look at the amount of abuse people and security people in Target, I'm sure that there's more than 100 of them, for example.
Well, the key thing, it sounds to me like we can't get away from the key thing is don't reuse your passwords across
Yes.
more than one site, and teach, and to people watching this video, it's very important to teach the people your friends, your family, to good password hygiene.
But Martin, I'm sorry, that doesn't work because they have too many accounts. There is nobody who has less than 100. You can't ask a human being. to
Which is
remember
why you
100
have to do the password manager route, right? It's better to do that than to have, one password that you use all across all different accounts.
Right.
Yes. So Erik alluded earlier to this thing that we have one thing that we go to all the time on the internet, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the monopolization. At least from my perspective, there are several monopolies, not necessarily per the definition, but Google has most of the searches. We couldn't help but notice during your talk this morning, Google was the example you came back to for a lot of the different examples you made. So I guess my question is, and this is true for Twitter and Facebook and a few other sites as well, Wikipedia and so on. The first one is this actually something that is dangerous for us as, not necessarily as white male people sitting in the Western world, but for the whole planet? And the second one, if so, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about, say, Wikipedia being mostly written in English by middle-class people that have the time to write, instead of poor people in Uganda that know more about their history but don't have the time or resources to write about it?
Well, I think we can probably all agree that at the end of the day, this is not a technology problem. This is a policy problem and a politics problem, and the correct domain to address it is the domain of politics and policy. Having said that, I note that it's interesting that Google can be beaten. Google is losing in Russia, right? Google is less than 50% market share in search because they have an excellent, high-quality, specialized local operator that does better. They're also losing in China, but that's because the government's hitting them over the head with a stick. But in Russia, they're losing fair and square. And also, I note that here in Europe, Google's market share is insanely high, like 95% or something like that, whereas in the US, it's actually down around 80.
Okay.
So,
And the rest is Bing?
Mostly Bing, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not obvious that the monopoly is entirely natural, and it's not obvious that Google can't be beaten. Having said that, obviously we should worry about those things. And I think actually the European legislators are, how do I phrase this, flailing around furiously, trying to find angles to address the perceived dangers of monopolization. And I really appreciate that they're doing that. The right to be forgotten laws and things like that. I actually disagree quite strongly with the details of the legislation they're bringing in, but, that's how politics works, right? You try things, and eventually, something in a horrible compromise sticks. Unfortunately, they're mixing up really laudable goals like privacy protection and so on with merchants who are unhappy that they get knocked off the top of the Google search results, and want some lawmaker to put them back on top. Wikipedia, I despair of that one. You can't fix it technologically, and I also don't think you can fix that one by policy. I think that's something the Wikipedian community has to fix themselves. And to their credit, they're aware of the problems they have in terms of being a monoculture. They haven't been making enough progress to satisfy even themselves. But it's not a hidden problem, at least.
Yeah, I feel a bit more optimistic, I guess, in the sense that monopolies are one of the bad things that come out of capitalist systems. We discovered that in the late 19th century, and you do need what you can do, and often through policy and government action is a useful counterforce to this. I'm less concerned in many ways about Wikipedia, because for all the cultural problems of Wikipedia, it is still wonderful to have an encyclopedia freely available to anybody that you can just get at. I mean, I can't contemplate how much I would have liked that 20 years ago as a kid.
But there is something different to the older monopolies, in that it is much, much easier for a monopoly to be created quite quickly. There is this factor where there's something really tangible that people can see convenience slightly better, and immediately from one day to another they can start using the new service. If you talk about supermarket chains or whatever you want, it takes a longer time because there's a lot of real world implications. And it is interesting when Tim talked about the right to be forgotten. At first I also thought that was a bit of a crazy attempt to solve it, but then I saw a different angle and I thought, okay, I'm slightly annoyed that I'm losing the convenience. I'm losing the convenience to just type into one box or whatever, so maybe all 3 search engines or whatever, type a query and get the results. But I realized that by that convenience came with strings attached. It comes attached with the algorithm that is running at the search engine provider, and also with all the newspapers that might have the information. When we talk about news, all the newspapers, how good their SEO teams are. So I gave away with my convenience my choice to think, actually I like that newspaper because in general I like their view on policy, or I want to see what a newspaper writes that I generally don't agree with. But this thought process is completely taken away because I'm just conveniently typing it in and I'm leaving it to algorithms that I don't control. The interaction of these algorithms nobody can really describe. And in the end, the right to be forgotten now makes me wonder, okay, maybe this is missing from the search index. Hey, let me just pick that newspaper, go there, and have that thought process again. It forces me to get out of that convenience that robbed me of something without me realizing it at first.
Right, but if you go to that newspaper, chances are that they're leasing out their search to Google. So when you try to find it on the web page of the newspaper,
and the ones
you might fall into the same trap.
And the ones that don't lease it out to Google usually have horrible, unusable search capabilities as well.
Maybe
it's interesting
to improve it.
On the subject of monopolies. I spent the first 20 years of my career as sort of a well-known enemy of Microsoft, because I loathed their monopolistic hold on the desktop. And Microsoft is still very strong and has very high proportion of business desktops, but less and less every year. The monopoly has been qualitatively sort of semi-broken and is weakening, and that was tremendously interesting. It was part legal action that did it, but it was also just part market evolution. So there's grounds for optimism about using policy action to weaken monopolies, but there's also grounds to hope that they might die of old age too.
Okay, so we're basically out of time, but I wanted to finish with one simple question, or maybe it's not very simple. The last 18 months, we've learned a lot about the privacy intrusions by a lot of government agencies, and we suspect that there is a lot more to find out. My wondering, or what I'm thinking about, is what the future looks like. What 20, 30, 50 years, are we going to fix these problems, or are we going to fall down into a totalitarian surveillance society, or are we going to end up somewhere in between? I guess the question is, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future right now?
I think that we have an excellent chance of keeping surveillance from being free. Right at the moment, surveillance is free. All it costs is the disks to store it on, and with the Perl scripts or whatever it is, they run over all the data to look for things they think are bad. And I think that we have an excellent chance of, increasing the proportion of all the internet traffic that is encrypted. That isn't going to stop a determined adversary, of course, but at the end of the day, you'll never stop the really determined adversary. So I think the current level of surveillance will become unsustainable for the people who are doing it. To that extent, I'm optimistic. To the extent of, will the public in general become sufficiently exercised about policy as to punish lawmakers who do stupid things and bring in more liberal ones, I'm not so terribly optimistic about that, and I think it will vary dramatically from nation to nation. You know, I think, frankly, Germany might be a leader. You know, the Germans have, you know, they're still living people who know about all the bad things that can, you know, happen, and I look forward with interest to see how much progress they make. So there are grounds for optimism, but you know, the politics are completely imponderable. Nobody's smart enough to predict that.
Yeah, I think the issue of surveillance and privacy is one of the biggest issues we have to face as a society at the moment, and certainly one of the biggest issues that we as a profession in software development have to face. And whether we'll deal with it or not depends entirely upon whether we try. If we don't try to do something about it, then we're definitely lost. We have to push to get there.
And, you know, it should be pointed out that as we push back against the pervasive surveillance, as a side effect, we're making life harder for the real bad guys. You know, the crooks and the fraudsters and the spam artists and generally all the private sector, you know, people who are trying to screw up the internet.
I also would split it, as Tim did, into technology and policy, and I think to a certain level I'm pretty confident that technology will get to the point where it becomes non-trivial to intercept all communication. But as with so many other things, if you're talking about state actors, I will never try to secure my home physically so that a state actor cannot enter.
Of course not.
At some point you have to have policy, and I also may, being German myself, agree that maybe Germany is quite at the forefront where people are demanding this. But what I would assume as well is that we will see further violation and further breaches that will convince more and more people that they are affected by mass surveillance. Because I think at the moment what stops people from asking politicians, from asking the policy makers to implement better laws is that they feel it doesn't affect me. They will catch the terrorists. As long as they catch the terrorists, I have nothing to hide, and all these arguments. And I think what we will see over the next 5 years are many more examples where it will become obvious to more and more people in the society that they will eventually be the target. It's always, initially in surveillance, it's always the marginalized people on the sides of society, investigative journalists. But I think we'll see so many examples that a majority, not a majority, but a large number of people, large enough number of people in many societies, in many democratic societies, will feel they're impacted by it, and they will punish the lawmakers for not making those laws.
I certainly hope you're right.
I want to be the optimist in this round.
Well, and from a technology standpoint, I feel like we as technologists, we have the responsibility to fix the tech. We can't fix the policy, we can't fix the education for everyone, but we have to do something about the technology.
But Ola, be really careful. When you say we can't fix the policy, that's not an excuse for ignoring politics, right?
We as civilians, we as citizens can definitely do our part in helping with policy and education, but we have more of a responsibility as technologists,
Absolutely.
I think.
Fair enough.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.